Men are told a simple story that males are perpetrators and females are victims, but the data is not that simple. In Australia, hundreds of thousands of men every year are the victim of violence at the hands of a female partner. International research indicates as well that females self-report violence against their male partners at rates sometimes higher than those of males against their female partners. It's important to also understand that context seems to only matter when the data focuses on female perpetration, but when a male perpetrates the same crime, all of a sudden everyone says that they want to make excuses. This episode is not about denying female victimisation, it's about refusing to erase male victimisation and to talk about the important fact that females can be perpetrators of violence against males, and males can be victims of violence perpetrated by females. So, with that said, first and foremost, thanks for tuning in today. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that before you forget. Your support's always much appreciated for helping the channel grow. I'd also like to say I'm actually filming this during the day, so I do apologise if there's any dogs barking in the background or the lighting is a little bit off. I think I do want to start filming it in the day because it gets quite late in the evening and things get out of hand. They take a bit longer than expected, inevitably. Today is really important to talk about female violence against men. This is something that I've had a great interest in for a very long time, well over a decade. When I wrote my honours in criminology thesis, I focused on reducing male violence against women in Tasmania, although I did actually initially want to write that thesis on female violence against males in our state. Needless to say, that was a little bit too ambitious and controversial for honours, so I was persuaded not to pursue that, unfortunately. When I say persuaded, I say I didn't really have an option, unfortunately. So I really want to discuss this. I know many men and have heard from many men who are not necessarily just my friends, but from around the world through your comments and your messages to me, which I greatly appreciate, and all your supporters really appreciate. But in terms of an Australian context, what we know is that the data is very real. There are male victims of female violence in intimate relationships, and we know that that number is in the order of 498,000 men who are the victims of female violence, female intimate partner violence. So, male victimisation doesn't just disappear because the perpetrator is a female, but unfortunately, in a socio-cultural context, in the media, in society more broadly, that does actually seem to happen. In fact, it is downplayed, it is denied, it is excused, and cruelly it is laughed at. So I think it's really important to sort of understand that this is a serious issue, and although disproportionately the victims of intimate partner violence are women who are harmed by men, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be addressing the other side of the equation if we want to have a truly well-rounded, full understanding of domestic violence and specifically intimate partner violence in Australia. We can't address the issue if we're only looking at one side of the coin, so to speak. And you can't do it holistically and in a way where the relationship between men and women in these dynamics is improved in any meaningful way, which I'll touch on a bit later in this video. What I'd like to also talk about is the self-reporting of physical violence by women themselves and their own self-reports of physical violence. It's what I would say is that, female violence is not rare enough to say that it's harmless and to excuse it. And the data seems to show that, although it's not talked about enough. There are studies out of New Zealand, for example, that indicate that about 37.2% of women versus 21.8% of men self-reported acts of physical violence towards their male partners. Now, that's actually a significant difference, and it's backed up by another study that was actually done in the United States, where they found that 28.3% of women versus 21.6% of men also reported committing physical violence against their male partners. So again, that seems to challenge this narrative that it's always more men. Now further, there's actually international studies, and in particular large meta-analysis that was conducted, where the statistical significance was reached for women actually perpetrating violence against their male intimate partners more than their male partners were perpetrating against them or at all. So that was coming out of the United Kingdom. So we've got data in Australia, we've got data in New Zealand, we've got data in the United States, we've got data in the United Kingdom, there's data from Canada as well. Some of these studies are multinational and involve people in different parts of the world collectively coming together, particularly on meta-analyses, which are a bit of a gold standard and quite hard to come by. So if we consider that data alone that I've just mentioned, which I guess you could sort of round it out to about, I don't know what you'd say, maybe 30 to about 35% of the women self-reporting violence against the men, and about 22% of the men reporting their violence against women, we can quite clearly see that challenges the narrative straight away. The main thing that comes up in these arguments is around the level of violence and the injury caused, and the differences between a woman committing violence against a male and a male committing violence against a woman, and the end outcome in terms of injury or lethality. Now, just because female violence against male partners is less injurious doesn't mean that it's harmless, excusable, and not abuse. It is. Cut and dry. Absolutely it is. Now, we can have arguments around that. We can obviously, refer to studies that indicate, and I'm not arguing against these studies, that the outcome does seem to be quite clear that when a male eventually decides to be violent towards his female partner, the consequences for that woman in terms of injury and lethality are higher than if it was reversed. That is just the way it is. Doesn't mean it doesn't occur the other way around, that women aren't harming men ever at the same level or with weapons or, such force that they cause serious injury or even death. It does happen. It just means that it's a rarer outcome. But that doesn't mean that the total rate of violence or the total incidence of violence perpetrated by women are less than men. And as I've opened up with, there are a number of studies and meta-analyses that indicate that that is actually not the case, that women aren't perpetrating some significant level of violence in relationships against their male partners. Now, I think it's important to sort of discuss, other than obviously the biological difference in men's strength on average than women's strength, which just applying common sense is going to mean that if a male for example, punches a woman, the force of his punch is likely going to be harder than the force of a woman's punch, and therefore the woman receiving that male punch is more likely to be injured than the male receiving the punch from the woman. Now, are there exceptions to the rule where there are very strong women, or women who have actually even trained in martial arts, who can absolutely knock a guy out and harm a guy? Absolutely. I mean, you can go on YouTube and watch videos and see that happen, unfortunately. It's just a general biological fact that is the average. There are plenty of men out there who get physically assaulted or beaten and are caused extreme pain or injury by women who are perhaps stronger than them, or those men are stronger than them, but they're just not applying that physical aggression necessary to defend themselves. Which brings me to an important point around men being seen as just punching bags for women. Right? Men are just seen as punching bags for women. And when you notice, for example, in public violent incidents where there's a man and a woman involved, a lot of people engage in the bystander effect and will stand around and jeer and laugh and make fun of a man who's being hit by his partner, his female partner, or indeed by another woman, and do absolutely nothing to help and protect him. Now, there are also cases where eventually a man does do something and he either strikes her back or restrains her, and then everyone, particularly other men, come in and then they want to be white knights and heroes to help that woman who's shown her character to be rock bottom, and then even assault the guy who's the victim of the assault. We're going to stop doing that. If that's the kind of guy you are, where you're going to stand around and watch another man be assaulted by a woman and do absolutely nothing, but then decide that you want to be a white knight and look like a tough guy and a hero when a guy finally strikes a woman back because he's just been abused, or he just engages in basic self-defense, then you're a loser. You're gutless. And you're doing it you have an ulterior motive. You're doing it for other reasons. You're not doing it because you genuinely care. You're doing it because it makes you look good. It makes you look like that hero. It gives you some feeling of confidence and some ego boost to you, right? But you didn't do it out of the kindness of your own heart. You didn't do it to be selfless. You did it to be self-serving and to make you look better to other women around you. You didn't do it to protect a fellow man of yours, right? You did it so you could increase your image to other women, to increase your chances of those women maybe wanting to talk to you and your probability of maybe getting laid. And that is just pathetic. If you're that kind of guy, you're pathetic. I have zero respect for you, and no other man with any decency should have any respect for you either. Another key point that I want to talk about is major studies from the past and where we're at currently. One of the studies I want to talk about is particularly important in terms of the general field of research around domestic violence and intimate partner violence generally. So what we saw, for example, and this is a very important study, and it's a controversial study, and I should preface this by saying this study is a study that somehow, I don't know how, it was done in 2010 by Murray Arnold Straus from the US of A, and he had been working domestic violence research for decades. Very well acclaimed, really highly respected internationally in his field. And he was actually the pioneer of the conflict tactics scale, which is a scale that is used internationally to effectively register how and measure how people handle conflict in their intimate partner relationships. So the conflict tactics scale, or the CTS as it's called, has been used extensively in this area of domestic violence and is still used. There's different versions of it that have been adapted and improved, but it has been incredibly important. its main criticism has been around the fact that it doesn't take into enough consideration context. Now, what do I mean by context? Well, context as in what any individual's feeling in terms of fear or their exposure to coercive control or underlying injury or motive, or any number of potential contexts, which, let's face it, could be infinite, right? I mean, context is extremely important, but is also extremely broad. So that is the main criticism of the conflict tactics scale. But of most concern, it seems that the criticism around the conflict tactics scale only seems to extend one way. And what is that one way? Well, that one way effectively is when the female is committing the violence against the male partner, that she did so because there were a number of other contexts at play that would explain her behaviour, or indeed make it more excusable or justifiable, or at a minimum more palatable. Now, that's concerning. So those criticisms have largely came from feminist literature, feminist researchers, and other people aligned with feminism and who have their interests in perpetuating the misnomer of gendered violence as being perpetrated only by men against women. The classic male perpetrator, female victim narrative, and something that has been used in domestic violence, for example, in the Duluth model, the Minnesota wheel of domestic violence and power and control, where effectively it's just assumed that men just use domestic violence, intimate partner violence, as a means of power of control through a number of different ways. In my honours in criminology thesis, I actually proposed something called the powerlessness and lack of control wheel, where I put forward the thesis, if you will, that a lot of men are actually committing that violence from a point of powerlessness. So from a point of maybe mental instability, alcohol addiction, socioeconomic factors, and other contexts that are important. But those contexts aren't considered when the male commits the violence against the woman, right? So it's a very clear double standard. And I really think that it's important that context is not used as a shield for women against male victims. But unfortunately, it is. And so that double standard needs to be called out. And it isn't called out enough. And Murray Arnold Straus in 2010 was the man to really do it. And in that time, he did a major study, I believe it was a meta-analysis as well, of about 200 different studies around intimate partner violence. And what he found was that there was actually a gender symmetry in the rates of violence, which actually goes back again to support the data that came after it, which I started off with at the beginning of this episode, which indicated that women were committing levels of intimate partner violence against their male partners at a level of parity, right? So at pretty much the same level as men, or at a level that was not really measurably different. So there was a gender symmetry there. Now, where there often isn't the gender symmetry, even admittedly in the work by Straus, was around the injurious nature and the outcome, which would often be more violent. But that sort of surprised me, because I, with my study and my background, somehow I didn't see this study through Google Scholar, PubMed, all different search engines, scholarly journal articles, couldn't find it, never came across it once, and then it just, through a bit of chat GPT research, it actually came up. So I think that it was probably a little bit buried and hidden in the research because it wasn't in the best interests of feminist researchers and a lot of general research departments, universities, etc., which deal in the areas of gender and gender inequality and gendered violence, and therefore have an interest in perpetuating a falsehood that it is only men or disproportionately men that are committing violence in intimate partner relationships, and that somehow the women are not doing anything at all. So this study said that there's a bilateral nature to the violence. So often the women were first striking, harming, spitting on, throwing objects out, any form of physical abuse and serious abuse, doing that to men first, and then the men were defending themselves and reacting, right? So that's one way. In other cases, it was the male initiating the violence and the woman defending herself and back. And in the vast majority of cases, both the people were as bad as each other. Okay? The men were hitting the women were hitting the men. And so people stay in those relationships of domestic violence, and it goes on and on and on in a vicious cycle. All right? But there is a parity and there's a gender symmetry there in that level of violence. So when you continue to hear this idea that all domestic violence is just highly male perpetrator initiated, that is not the case. That comes from data around the intimate partner homicide deaths data that we have. Now, on average, it's saying like 40 to 60 women, depending on the year, are killed by a male intimate partner. Okay? Now, it's then said 50% of female homicide is at the hands of a male partner. Now, that 50% number comes from a number of only a couple hundred total homicide deaths of women in Australia compared to the thousands of deaths of men just generally. So that 50% number is concerning as a total percentage of crime and an issue, but it is taken out of, I should say, a very small number of actual total deaths. Now, I think it's important also to explain why that is not really unsurprising. If we know that most violent acts and most homicides are committed by men, and it's disproportionately men against men, then it is obviously reasonable and makes sense that women are going to more than likely be killed by a man, just generally speaking, whether it be their partner or not. Now, is that great? Well, no, of course it's not great. It's horrible. But we know that men are killing men at a far, far higher rate than women. It just means that the small portion of women that are actually murdered as a whole in the population obviously are more likely to be killed by a man. And it's obvious that the man that they are most likely to have the most contact around and increase the probability of being murdered is likely to be a male intimate partner. That doesn't excuse female victimization. It doesn't mean that these deaths aren't tragic. But when you really disaggregate the data and think about it, it just makes sense. It just makes sense. Obviously, if you are in a relationship with someone of one sex, and that sex is responsible for a crime disproportionately in the total population, then your probability of being victimized by that sex is likely going to be far higher. And in the event that something happens, well, it's likely going to be committed by that person who is representative of that total population. That's not unreasonable. That just makes sense statistically that would happen. So when we think about that, the idea that there is a a epidemic of male violence against women in Australia. I think, once again, using that kind of wording sort of leads you to another misnomer, if you will. So clearly, 50% of women, or thereabouts, high 40s, thereabouts, who are killed by a male intimate partner. And that is awful, and there's no excuse for that. Okay? There is no excuse for that. But we need to be serious when we say, well, what are the total numbers here? And why is that happening? And we then also need to say, well, what were the circumstances leading up to that? What are the police records of these couples? Because I can almost guarantee that a lot of those women in those relationships were the same sort of women that we know through the research were also engaging in, if not on many occasions, also starting physical violence against their male partner. And the male has reacted to that, and he has struck her or pushed her or whatever it might be, and through his sheer biological differences in strength, he has killed her. I would like to know what the data is around that and see if that can be disaggregated, but I can almost guarantee that even through places like the Australian Institute of Criminology or the Australian Bureau of Statistics or whoever it might be, it's going to be very hard to find any data around what led up to that and what was happening. Okay? Now, why is that? Well, because again, it's in the best interests of feminist organisations who largely control these data sets at a government level and at large organisational levels to not say anything bad about the woman, because then it is seen as victim blaming. Okay? Well, there is the possibility that two things can be true at once. The man might have killed that woman and she's a victim, but that woman may have also been victimising that man for a very long time. We have the battered woman defence or battered wife defence in some states of Australia and other parts of the world, where there have been a number of cases where women have brutally murdered or executed their husbands, and then they have got a lighter sentence or got off the charge because they claimed the battered wife or battered woman syndrome, right? Or defence, as it's called, the battered woman defence, battered wife defence. There are very few cases where it's been the other way around, where it's been the battered husband defence, or the battered husband syndrome, or the battered man defence, or the battered man syndrome. It's not studied. In much the same way as we have the term toxic masculinity, right? And that's a research topic. We don't really have a plethora of research equivalent on toxic femininity. In fact, toxic femininity is seen as internalized misogyny. So internalized misogyny in and of itself is a concept, but then they take the concept of toxic femininity and then they try to make it just a synonym, right? Because once again, it's not in the best interest of a lot of activist groups and feminist organizations to have any single concept or any research at all that points the finger at women's behavior, right? At female behavior. Yet research like this, which is often hard to find, does indicate that women are perpetrating just as much intimate partner violence against their male partners as their male partners are perpetrating against them. And in many cases, in large research articles done, whether it be in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the USA, Canada, etc., indicate that actually women are initiating and perpetrating more of the violence against men, and that no, it is not out of pure self-defense as the claim is done, or they were doing it because they finally snapped due to the terrible treatment of their partner. They're just doing it because they are unstable, unkind, unloving, and abusive partners. We've got to stop making excuses. And as I've said, with Murray Straus's research, the main criticism was that, context isn't considered when the woman is harming her partner or killing her partner. And they go, you're right, context isn't considered. Let's look at the context and let's explain away her abuse or murder of this man because she's a woman who was having a hard time with her partner. But then if a man goes, hey, what about my context? Actually, I was a loving partner, really good, but she was an unstable woman who emotionally, psychologically abused me and used coercive control over and over again, who cheated on me continually. And then on top of that, physically assaulted me numerous times. And I eventually snapped and fed her a knuckle sandwich. And I critically injured her, or I killed her. I would really like to see the research on what men in prison accidentally murdered their partner, their female partner, or what men did it out of sheer brutality because they're an absolute monster. Because I think it's important to delineate there. It is not good for a man to hit a woman, but you know what? It's not good for a woman to hit a man. It is understandable for a woman to hit a man in self-defense because she keeps getting hit by him, and it is understandable for a man to hit a woman eventually if he is being assaulted over and over again. The argument there is always going to be, well, he needs to restrain and pull back his level of severity in the violence. Well, that's all well and good coming from someone viewing it objectively from the outside who isn't living the experience of being punched or spat on or threatened with a knife or having objects thrown at them. It's very easy to say to a man who's been abused for years and years and years, who eventually snaps and slaps a woman or punches a woman or shoves a woman, that, oh, he should have just moderated his violence. Well, maybe he moderated it by never doing any violent acts towards her for years. And maybe, eventually, her level of violence got so severe that she started, as we know on the research is not uncommon, using household things like pots and pans and knives to threaten him with, and he has just snapped. Right? So I know that I'm going to get a lot of hate over this. I know this will probably be clipped and be like, well, you're a misogynist and you're making excuses and so on and so forth. I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit. Say what you want to say. Do what you want to do with the footage. Clip it however you want. There is no excuse for people to just be harming people willy-nilly with no consequence. Right? Okay? If you're a man and you hit a woman, expect the woman to hit you back. If you're a woman and you hit a man, expect the man to hit you back. All right? Now, with that being said, it's important to talk about the systems around this and male victimization as well. And apologies if I'm a bit heated because I'm just sick to death of these narratives, right? Am I the kind of guy that if I was with a mentally unstable woman, which, yeah, I'm not going to divulge too much, I'll just shut up there. If in the situation that I was hypothetically with someone like that, would I beat the shit out of them? Even if they were hitting me? No, I probably wouldn't. Would I physically restrain them if I had to? Probably, particularly if they start picking up things like knives or pots and pans. Probably, yeah. I think most men, if they're being honest, would say yeah. And I think if women were being honest, a lot of women would go, hey, fair enough, mate. Fair enough. You've got to protect yourself. All right? I think a lot of, being fair to women, there are a lot of great women out there who would say, yeah, defend yourself, and or, as rough as this, she deserved it. Okay? Which sounds awful, but it's important to discuss. Now, the problem is at a systemic level is that many men do not just suffer the abuse. Many men suffer the disbelief of their abuse at a societal level. That's really important to remember. Okay? And it is heartbreaking because now it's been 11 years that I started researching this and doing the research and looking at the numbers. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. In fact, there's research out of New South Wales, the police data, that female criminality, particularly female delinquency, is getting higher than young men and boys, or is certainly increasing at a far higher rate. So what are we doing with our kids and our young people, our youth delinquency? If they're doing it at a young age, they're going to do it in adulthood in a relationship, and they're going to fall in a relationship either with a total scumbag guy who's going to be just as violent and maybe kill them, or they're going to fall for a young man who cares and loves them and wants to be the fixer personality, and the poor bugger ends up in an abusive relationship, and actually he becomes the victim, and he's either ruthlessly abused emotionally, psychologically, physically, sexually even, or eventually he's harmed to a critical level or killed. And that's a very real probability. But the fact of the matter is that 1.3 million men in Australia report being the victim of emotional and psychological abuse and coercive control in particular. 1.3 million men. Now, that emotional, psychological, and coercive control is coming from their female partners. Not just generally. So there's 1.3 million men in Australia report being the victim of emotional and psychological abuse by their female partner. That isn't a trivial number. It's not a trivial number. That's not something that we should just brush under the rug, okay? And in addition to that, over 745,000 men report being the victim of financial abuse by their female partner. Again, that's not a trivial number, yet we seem to act like this is something that just because it maybe occurs less on average, or certainly in my belief is just significantly underreported, when we look at the earlier numbers I mentioned from self-reporting from women, the men just aren't reporting it, but the women are actually reporting themselves, that this isn't necessarily uncommon or some fringe or rare case. This is serious. So I think that when you consider these numbers, what is very clear is the male silence and their feelings of shame and ridicule, and knowing full well that if they speak about the issue, that they will effectively be disbelieved. And that is a very sad state of affairs that we have. And you're not going to improve domestic violence in Australia, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in New Zealand, in Canada, anywhere in the world, if you're not addressing the other 50% of the equation, which is female behaviour. And it's female victimisation of males. It's never going to change. And it's in the best interest, as I said, of feminist ideologues to continue that narrative, because then they get to keep their jobs. They get to stay as researchers. The domestic violence keeps occurring. They keep getting the funding, and they keep their jobs getting a clip on the ticket of that funding. It makes sense, right? That's why nothing's changed in Tasmania in the 11 years since I wrote my thesis, pointing out the problems with domestic violence in Tasmania and how it's not properly being treated through primary prevention, and the failures of the main primary prevention strategy being used, which is respectful relationships education, which is written by LGBTQIA plus advocates, and literally says that within that program and curriculum that it should be the case that heteronormative behaviour is removed and discouraged in favour of promoting LGBTQIA plus ideology. Okay? And I'll have more to say about that eventually. I can't say too much now because I've got some legal stuff happening with this, but that's a big issue. People who are running the curriculums in charge of these things are ideologically bent and set out to demonise boys and men and to excuse and protect young girls and women at all costs, regardless of how abhorrent and heinous their behaviour has been, is, or might in the future be to other boys and men. Okay? That's just the way that is. So, look, I've talked about a bit today, and I think the main thing I want to say, again, is that male victimisation doesn't just appear because the perpetrator is female. Male victims are very real, and female perpetrators are very real. And the latter of the two, according to self-reports of females themselves, is that they admit that they are perpetrating intimate partner violence against their male partners at the same level or often higher levels than males are perpetrating against their female partners. That's just a fact. And if you don't like it, I couldn't care less. That's the research. And far more research needs to be done on it because not enough is done about it due to academic censorship. We spend $4 billion plus, I think over 5 years, or it might even be per year in Australia, on the national campaign to reduce male violence against women and children. Yet there's no equivalent to protect men and boys. Nothing's set up there. We don't have enough men's shelters. There's not enough single father programs. There's a great program in Tasmania called DIY Dads, which if you're watching this in Tasmania, a single father and you need help, I would reach out to them. They do great work, and I've referred young fathers there and have helped them with housing. So that's really good. But yeah, look, as I said, there's more I want to unpack on this. My next video is going to be on false accusations of sexual assault. So once again, make sure you please subscribe so you can get the notification around that. That's going to be a very heavy topic, and the data on that is very grim. All right, and it aligns with this. We're seeing that there's we're seeing that there is an incongruence between what the general research and data is, right? What men are reporting and what women are reporting, and like with intimate partner violence, in the case of sexual assault, just a bit of a teaser here, women are reporting worse numbers than what the men are reporting, what the research is finding. So it's coming straight from the horse's mouth, yet we're ignoring it entirely. So I think that what I would like to sort of close on is that if we only recognize the victims when it fits their narrative, we're not protecting the victims. What we're protecting is an ideology. And that's what so much of this is. It's all ideology, left-wing ideology, Marxist ideology, and hardcore third, fourth, and fifth wave feminist ideology. First and second wave feminists at least did care about men and boys and saw that they were important and that they were needed and that they were more than just pawns in a game, right? They had more than just the utility of their strength and protection. They offered love, support, and had importance in the family unit. So first and second wave feminists would be rolling in their graves. Some second wave feminists are still alive if they could see where we are today. All right. So yeah, big shout out to Jermaine Greer there, one of the great feminists, obviously, of that era. So anyway, I think that's all I've got to say today. It's a bit of an intense one. Apologies once again if there's too much background noise, dogs barking and sound. I'd really obviously love your support. If you haven't already, please, as I said before, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel, like my videos, leave a comment. I love reading your comments. Thank you so much for your support. And share this video. I'd really encourage you to share this video with as many men as possible and to get the word out and encourage them to follow me on all my social media. I'm also on Instagram under Existential Evan and TikTok and Facebook as well, all under the same name. So your support is greatly appreciated. I do read your comments and it means the world to me. Okay. So anyway, I think that's all I've really got to say about that today. So as always, thanks for watching and I hope you have a great day.